navigating through the coronavirus emergency has made enormous demands of leaders and managers at every level of every organisation that's been caught up in it. And even when we do start to emerge on the other side of the pandemic, let's hope sometime next year, the after effects will be felt probably for years to come. As Gillian just said, nothing is likely ever to be the same again. So to round off the conference, as Nicola said, we're delighted to have with us Tracy Daszkiewicz, who knows a thing or two about leading through a crisis. She was Director of Public Health in Wiltshire at the time of the Novichok poisoning affair in Salisbury in 2018, memorably portrayed in the TV drama series, as Nicola said, by Anne Marie Duff. Tracy was, I think it's fair to say, catapulted into the national and global limelight when news broke of the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, and the subsequent tragic death of Dawn Sturgis, who inadvertently handled the discarded container that had contained the deadly nerve agent. No one has been held to account for the outrage, of course, but we did learn that two Russian gentlemen had such an admiration for the famous spire of Salisbury Cathedral, 123 metres, as they told the world later. They had travelled to the city from London, especially to see it at exactly the same time as the Skripals were attacked. Quite astonishing coincidence. Tracy said of her experience later, "My heart was in my mouth. I had to appear calm, to listen carefully and do my job. But it wasn't easy. There were expletive moments for sure." Tracy's got on to become Deputy Director of Population Health and Wellbeing at Public Health England, but still lives near Salisbury and joins us from her home. She's going to talk broadly about the importance of public health work, safeguarding during emergencies like this year, and the lessons she carries with her from the Novichok episode. I'll then ask her some questions, and you can put your question to her via the Q&A box on your screen. So please do so. But first, let's hear from Tracy. Tracy.
Thank you very much indeed. Don't quite know how to follow that introduction. I suppose I should start with an apology that it is little old me and not Anne Marie Duff, but I will do my best. I think for me, I started my career in social care, so it is my great pleasure to be amongst you all this afternoon, be it talking about safeguarding through a slightly different lens, but not altogether different. Public health and safeguarding go absolutely hand in hand. We both care hugely about our people and the populations we serve and work amongst, so there is a great crossover. Public health for me has been a very diverse career. I've worked across health and social care for in excess of 26, 27 years now. And around that, there has been many surprises along the way. I've been involved in all sorts of things, and some calamities of my own making as I've tried to lobby for change. But it is hugely varied, and like Mr. Gump here, life is definitely like a box of chocolates in our world. We don't know what we're going to get. I prefer strawberry creams, but sometimes I get a nutty one, which isn't always so good. If we could take the next slide, please. Can we move on to the next slide? There we go. So throughout my career, I've worked in a range of things. I suppose the first public health pandemic that I was involved with was HIV. That was at the start of my career as a HIV social worker. And this was not necessarily at the height of the pandemic, but it was an interesting time. It was at the time when we were just getting the emergence of combination therapies, which were brutal and in themselves quite impactful on people taking them. But what it did, it started to give a glimmer of light for people that up until that point, without treatments, had faced what was a very quick death after a period of time of huge stigma and impact on their lives that impacted every part of their lives. People lost family members, lost housing tenancies, lost jobs. The impact of this was immense. And for me, as a newly qualified professional, it was a particular time of learning. I had lost my best friend to an AIDS-defining illness in 1998. So I sort of carried his illness and his experience with me throughout the early stages of that career. And in fact, it was his diagnosis that made me change my intentions, which had always been to go into child protection. And around that started a huge amount of lobbying, and those of us that work in and around social care, we know people's lives don't sit in neat little lists, and they're not contained, and one impact on their lives leads to another, and we tend to get involved into every aspect of their lives. So whereas HIV was definitely the presenting issue here, the other things that enthralled around that, such as housing, benefits, immigration, which was an area that I did develop a huge specialism and interest in for people that had got diagnosed why here, and mainly on student visas, and then were facing the prospect of being sent to their home countries without any prospect of treatment. So taking the opportunity to lobby and become the voice for those people that feel that they haven't got theirs becomes a huge part of the work that we do. In and around this, what we're seeing globally is a huge increase in terms of natural disasters. This is an impact, obviously, of global climate change, and we're seeing the far-reaching devastation of floods and earthquakes. Most recently, California, where they're raging bushfires within a matter of days switched to devastating snowfalls. So it's not just the impact of one thing, it's the impact of something else that comes quickly on its heels. But alongside that, we've also got the phenomenon of infectious disease, which of course COVID is one of those that falls into those natural disasters. And we see this most commonly within flu, but we also see it across a whole range of viruses and illnesses that we're dealing with. And alongside these natural disasters, public health is also heavily involved in the man-made disasters, so warfare, biohazards, and of course terrorism. So if we go on to the next slide. Behind every disaster, there are people, and what I found astonishing as I've fallen into emergency planning almost by accident by virtue of being part of a public health team. And what has always struck me about it is the fact that we talk a lot about economic regeneration after a disaster. We talk about the buildings and we talk about places. The conversation that is less obvious and less at the forefront is the conversation about people. And this was something that really stood out for me whilst working on the incident in 2018. I was involved from the first day. I had a call on that morning to say I needed to get into the office. There was going to be a call to discuss the incident that had taken place. And it quickly accelerated and started to emerge itself into the story that you will have all read in the press. And the impact of this attack on a resident of Salisbury and his daughter, and how far-reaching this was. And it's not just in terms of the impact of a potential deadly chemical being used within your neighbourhood. You know, his house was surrounded by other houses. With people living in them, but it's what is going on behind those doors. And also, as we closed workplaces down and cordoned off parts of the city, people's homes, workplaces and cars were caught behind those cordons and therefore became either hard to access or inaccessible. People were going in and out of their homes and having to identify themselves as they entered and as they left. This huge impact on people's just usual liberty. And then within that, as we started the decontamination process and getting buildings and businesses back online, the anxiety of going back into places where people knew that this chemical had potentially been used, and how you then communicate that to people. You're dealing with people with very different understanding of what happened. The impacts on them are very different. So every conversation you have needs to be adjusted and varied to meet those meet the conversation that's going to be the context of those individuals. This was hugely challenging, and the thing that I've watched as COVID has emerged is the way whole organisations have stood up. There has been the most incredible infrastructure around this, with a huge emphasis on making sure that the people within our communities that are vulnerable are well supported. Because this was in many ways, the incident in Salisbury in many ways was only affecting a small geography. It was only affecting directly a small number of people. Indirectly, it was a far bigger group, but directly it was that. So those sort of structures didn't stand up in the same way around this. So that work that we do within social care and the way you are so close to your communities, that was quite hard to implement in this space. And the other thing was about how we, whilst we're in a public health emergency or any kind of emergency situation, how we start to think about how we're going to look after our people into the future. We respond very quickly to the emergency and the risk. It's what we're trained to do. But then what you're doing is looking at a period of time that stretches out in front of you for an infinite amount of time. Recovery takes far longer than response does. So in terms of community support, this was needed to be put in quickly and without necessarily an off the peg approach to it, really. It was such an unusual response. So there was a lot of work done with colleagues from Public Health England. They were doing a lot of work in terms of going and setting up information points in the towns, and that happened for Salisbury, and then later in June when the second incident happened in Amesbury. But those closer conversations I took on, and I was therefore working with the businesses quite closely in terms of staff anxiety, but also going and having meetings with the residents that lived close by. The first incident was easy in this space. It was 7 houses, and we could gather quite easily, because what you can't do is take these conversations into a public venue. The second incident was harder because that was a much bigger estate, but we managed it. And by having those conversations, I made myself single point of contact because that consistency was needed. What's been astonishing since, and you know, every opportunity brings a learning, a set of learning outcomes with it. But for me, the thing that surprised me most was the amount of criticism that came my way as a result of that. It was a case that I had got too close to individuals in terms of being available for that support, but also about how long I stayed connected. You know, that there is still connection to those communities now. And for me, it was the obvious thing to do. I don't know whether it's the case if you take the girl out of social work, but you can't take the social worker out of the girl. I'm not sure. But for me, it was something that I felt compelled to do, and something that I'm really glad I did. And if a similar incident, heaven forbid it won't be anything like Novichok, but if a similar incident happened, I would do it again in exactly the same way. And it's how we build the infrastructures around us. But within this space, as we think about response, something like COVID has brought a huge teams together. And as Gillian so eloquently discussed just ahead of this, the work that everybody is doing, and not just in roles that you're used to doing. People are being redeployed. Even if you're doing your own job, you're doing it in a very, very different way. And it's how we put those structures in place. But more importantly, how we bring those skills and expertise into the emergency planning space. From working on emergency planning, I've done a range of exercises and practices. We do them all the time, so that when these events happen, we're able to step into them and able to respond. And then what happens is, when we get into big crisis like COVID, not everybody has had the experience of doing those practices. In that contained group around local resilience forums, we formed really strong relationships, and it was certainly those relationships that made working on Salisbury and Amesbury so important. They were there. It became bedrock. We knew each other well. We'd worked together for a number of years, and we also knew each other's strengths and expertise. So we knew what part of the incident and who we were turning to. And it puts you in a place where you can do the unusual in the usual way, because you've got those structures around you. And it's similar to what I've seen happening across health and social care with COVID. Very much those skills and that expertise is coming to the fore, and you're just automatically doing what you're trained to do and what you believe you're there to do. But I do wonder how much we could bring this into the space where we're doing practicing, and both for response and recovery, so that steadfast support is in place and those structures remain long after the response is over. Of course, within all of this, there is us as individuals and how we maintain that. Again, Gillian talked about this in terms of how tired people are and how hard everybody's working. And it's also about the fact that at the moment, we know that we're going to be on this for a little bit longer into the future. And how do we safeguard ourselves within that? Maintaining our personal relationships and our personal friendships around a time when we are so busy. And Gillian put the question about how we support teams, and I'm watching that. I've moved from one part of public health into another part of public health over recent months, and just seeing the impact. And people are working, people talk about 24/7, and that really is happening across the board. And some of those roles are incredibly visible and some of them aren't, but there is a whole huge range of people working across things. And for me, the bit that we need to do is to think about when our own personal time is going to come, when we can do that and plan for our own recovery so that we're able to do that. What happens in all of these situations, and it certainly happened in 2018, it was a core group of us working on the response that were then going to be responsible for taking forward the recovery. And it's how you get through. In response, your adrenaline's there, it's immediate, and you're working on that. Recovery takes a very different lens, and it takes a lot longer. So it draws on a different skill set, but from the same people who are already tired. So how do we restore ourselves enough to work in that space? And occasional days off do some good around that, but obviously you need to be planning on how you're going to build in your own restoration along the way, and how you draw on your teams around you to do that. Salisbury was gruelling. I worked on Salisbury for 11 months without a break, and I know the personal impact that had, and a lasting impact. David talked within the introduction in terms of some of those crucial things. It wasn't just the extraordinary nature of these events, it was being close to the people that it impacted. And it's heartbreaking to work alongside people that are dealing with such enormous, impactful issues, but also a massive privilege to be invited into those spaces. But within that, you hold that very, very close to you, and that takes its toll on you emotionally. My absence had an impact on my family. It certainly had an impact on my son, who was 12 at the time. And it's how you find your ways of doing that. So build that in while you're thinking about everybody else, which I know we're all very good at, and we think about ourselves less. Think about how you're going to look after yourself into your future and repair from this, and draw on the people around you that you've got the shared experience with. The compassion of ourselves is hugely important. The symbol on the screen here is obviously well used. Within our family, we use this a lot, and we've used it with my son since he was about 3. When we tried to, he asked when he was about 3, when he was going through his why stage. Why do we love each other, and what is love, and how does it feel, and all those sort of questions, impossible questions that 3-year-olds ask us that we have to somehow find the answer to. And I describe love to him as it feels like your heart's going to burst, So from that, he always said, "Love you, boom." And about 3 weeks into the incident, I said, "Love you, boom," as I'd ran in for a change of clothes. And Toby looked me square in the face and said, "No, boom." And it was at that moment that I realised the impact I was having, but also the despair of knowing there was nothing I was going to be able to do about it for some time, because I was needed elsewhere. And for a period of time, that need was greater elsewhere. And that is a terrible choice to make. And again, Gillian talks about the sacrifices that people have made, and how they've separated themselves from their family for the greater good of performing in this pandemic space. And people are doing that up and down the country. So for me, it is important that regardless about what the incident is, and you probably couldn't get more different things than Novichok and COVID, but it almost doesn't matter what the actual incident is. Our needs as professionals, but more importantly, the needs of us as human beings to enable us to look after the people that need us is so important. So I suppose the takeaway message for me is to put your own life jacket on first, to enable you to safeguard your own self so that you can carry on safeguarding others. Within every emergency situation, there are people's vulnerabilities being exacerbated. And with COVID, the protective factors that have been put in place to stop transmission, I listened to some of the videos over the lunchtime, and you can see that those protective factors that have been put in place have exacerbated other risks and other harms as people have been thrown into places of isolation or loneliness. And then the brilliance of the workforce around them and how they've been able to mitigate and overcome some of those things to make sure people feel safe and secure. We know the impact that loneliness has on people. We also know the impact that lack of security has on people, and we're going into a period of time where jobs and all sorts of things are going into an uncertain place. So what we do as professionals in terms of looking after ourselves will better enable us to look after the people that we're here to work with. Thank you for listening, and I really do welcome questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That's absolutely fascinating, and your experience gives you a unique perspective. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm hearing a bit of echo. I don't know where that's coming from, whether other people can hear that. Okay, as Tracy said, very much want your questions for the remaining 20 minutes of this session or so. I've got plenty of questions, but I'll gladly use all the time myself. But I'd much rather that you chipped in with your questions too. Tracy, let's start with the distinction you make between the response and the recovery, and you warn that the recovery period takes much longer than the response. Would you care to kind of put a length of time on that coming out of COVID?
So, all things being equal, you should start your recovery processes at the start of any response. That's really hard to do because it's hard to put yourself in those two spaces. But if you wait until response ends before you start the recovery, you won't have the things in place to do it. And some things will come back online a lot easier. Once capacity frees up in one part of the service, you can open up the capacity for something else. What's harder, and certainly in the incidents that I've been part of, what you see on a human level and in terms of that recovery from trauma or those people that have been impacted, you usually see that recovery process starting about 2 to 5 years after the event. So if you think about that, it's going to be some time before we truly get to the start line of things. And of course, for people that have lost people during COVID and possibly didn't say goodbyes or probably weren't there at end of death, which is just heartbreaking, the impact of that will come at the moment because we're in lockdown and our lives are different. That process may not have started in terms of the grief process. People may not have started yet, despite the fact it could have been weeks and months since they've lost their loved ones. So we're going to need to think about recovery for years into the future from this. It's not going to be quick.
Would you mind if I asked a question, Tracy?
Go ahead, Nicola.
That's a very sobering. That's a very sobering warning, Tracy. But I'm sure you're right. I'm sure this is.
Okay, Tracy, that was a really powerful presentation. Thank you. As a parent of a teenager, I found what you were saying both amazing, but then incredibly heartbreaking too. And over the last few months, I've really had to balance the time I've had to spend and prioritise around work based on all the needs of my family at home as well, and made even more difficult by the fact that my son was at home because he couldn't go to school, and I was working at home, but more often than not with the door closed. And it's, I suppose, what I'm wondering is, how does your son feel now? Is he able to, you know, reflect back on the time and understand the difficult position you were in?
I suppose his time's moved on. We're 3 years on, so he's now 15. So the natural order of things is he hates me anyway. So that helps. But he's actually great. It's really hard, and I really, when you've just talked about that in terms of being in the same house but the door closed, I think that's almost harder. I found it harder being here but not here than what I was when I was, obviously I just wasn't in the building in 2018. I was nowhere near the house, but here I'm sort of here but continually absent. So absolutely can appreciate that. He's absolutely fine. He reflects. Obviously, I've gone on to do hugely embarrassing things like making him be on the telly and all of that kind of thing, because that was definitely all my fault. So I've put layers on it, but I think for him, once we come out of it, and there was a period of time, I took a week off in February, which was sort of month 11, and I had a week off at the beginning of February, and I just scrubbed my house, and then I went back to work for a week, and then I had half term off and just immersed myself in him. And I mean, he barely spoke to me, but you know, whatever he was doing, I was doing with him, or at least watching him do it. And we did have some nice chats, generally in the car. Kids speak better in the car, don't they, when they don't have to look at you. and he was very honest in the fact that he felt abandoned and those kind of things. But then I was able to explain to him why and what I'd done. And I suppose for me, as we come on then a year later and the drama happened, and obviously people aren't always going to have that, but it was then able to have sort of a behind the door look at it. So I suppose the more that we can describe in all of its detail as we can with our children, because they understand so much, I think will bring them along with us. And of course, they've had their own disruption, haven't they, through this with school and breaking from their own social groups. So they have experienced it for themselves.
Thank you. David, have we got you back now?
Can I come in again? Apologies, I'm having some connectivity problems. Thank you for stepping in, Nicola. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, David.
Can you hear me now? I think I have some connectivity issues.
Yeah, we can hear you, David.
Yes. Excellent. Okay, thank you. Tracy, you talked about the criticism you faced personally about your style, about your very close involvement with people, and I wonder if it's inevitable that there will be a blame game after COVID, and that local leaders will face similar accusations of how they've handled things.
I think it's a sad fact, isn't it? That often happens, and I've read quite a lot around this since doing 2018 in particular, to try and get an understanding of where that comes from. And I suppose for me, what we don't do, I've talked a little bit about how we exercise and plan and practice. What we don't do is try and take a critical view during those processes in terms of how we would be viewed externally, and take that opportunity to try and understand where blame and criticism could come from. And of course, blame and criticism is a divergence tactic, and it will inevitably come. And I think for people that have just worked so tirelessly, that their story and their reasoning and their rationale is really important. And equally for me, I can explain why I took the approach I did. And like I say, whilst it wasn't in my job description, if we all worked to our job description, what a sorry state we would all be in right now. So I think every now and again you have to do the right thing, and sometimes that isn't the rules, and it isn't the point to point 3 on our job descriptions. Our job descriptions are only ever a guide, and thank goodness for that, whereas nothing would ever get done. So it's inevitable, but I think it's just something that we will face when it comes, but it's less important than doing the right thing when it needs to be done.
We've had a question from somebody online saying, how do you keep a workforce sustained through a prolonged period of emergency like this, as opposed to just the adrenaline of the immediate response? What's the trick?
It's really, really hard, and I think because people are incredibly conscientious and really, really dedicated, and they won't take the time off willingly. Every now and again, the leaders and those people that are able to do so need to tell people to step away. And it is incredible when you are this tired and running so hard. You don't need your usual fortnight. You need 2 or 3 days, and the difference that makes to people. And for ourselves, we need to look to ourselves to either seek that 2 or 3 days, and those of us that can, make sure people are taking it. It's just so important and makes such a difference. And I had 2 days off this week, and I sat and watched Netflix for 1 day of it. I did stuff on the second day, but I did nothing for 1 whole day. And when I went back to work yesterday, I felt like a new person. In 2018, I didn't do that, and I've really learned from it. And you know, I took that, and I know now that I'm on until next weekend, and I know then always know when your next day off is, and make sure you've got them in. And unfortunately at the moment we can't do cuddles and cake.
Yeah, back to you, David.
In sheer practical terms, Tracy, how did you deal with the emergency in Salisbury? Obviously, you had day-to-day stuff to do. The team had to keep doing the day job as well as the sudden emergency. How did you address that?
Yeah, it was really, really lucky. I had a fab team in Wiltshire, and we put the rota on for the different roles that needed to be performed along the incident, and people were rotated on. And then the team was split in terms of those that would then focus on business as usual. So it worked incredibly well. And then within the incident, there was a core 5 of us that were there throughout. And it's that trade-off between consistency and looking after yourself. but there was 5 of us that were pretty much there day in, day out for those many months. And that brought a huge amount of support because we knew exactly where each other were within that. So I had the support of the team, and a team that I'd worked as part of. I was very lucky. I'd worked in that team since 2008. So relationships were very strong. People knew each other incredibly well. So I was able to rely on that and know that people would get on. And I was obviously contactable, and I was keeping regular contact with the team. But then within the incident, having that core team around me, that multi-agency team and my own team, meant that you've just got that feedback, and people that were rotated onto the incident were then going back into the office, so they were able to feed back through, and it became a continuous sort of communication loop. Because it was very challenging. We were working in extraordinary circumstances, as we are now, and different methods of communication had to be put in place. So having that rolling with people rotating on and off coming through meant that contact was maintained. So it worked incredibly well, and thankfully I had brilliant people around me that were organising that.
How many agencies were involved in all in the Salisbury emergency?
Certainly at the height of the response, you would count 27, 28 agencies around the table.
Goodness.
It was massively diverse because we were looking at all sorts of things. You know, it was everything from the public health element, police investigation, environmental impacts, building and structures, the decontamination process. It was huge. So yeah, it was a massive group of people.
How do you coordinate 27 or 28 agencies on a day-to-day rolling crisis?
That's the skill of the chair, and certainly when we were in the height of the response, it was chaired by Deputy Chief Constable, and what an amazing conductor he is, just absolutely incredible. And you learn a lot in these situations. I mean, you obviously bring a lot to them, and we all do as individuals, our skills and experience, but then you have the opportunity to actually watch other people and the brilliance that happens there, and he certainly was fab.
And were there lasting positives from this experience? Do you think that interagency working in Wiltshire has improved as a consequence?
Our LRF structures and partnership was pretty strong, and it's catch-22, isn't it? And I think it was pretty strong. It'd been a fairly stable membership for some time, which I think meant that as we went into this space, it happened quite seamlessly. It was hard work, and but we all knew each other, which really helps. And I think, like COVID, I think any amount of work you do in an intense space on a shared issue brings people together. I certainly know that from the relationships I made, particularly with that core 5 of us that was there, they now cross the boundaries very much into a friendship, as well as professional relationships, because we just shared so much. You can't help relationships changing in that way, and that's a huge positive.
Thinking about public health more generally, as a question from Neil Ayling online, saying your role and the subsequent drama series has really brought public health to be understood and appreciated by the public. And some of this, he says, has been repeated a little during COVID with public appreciation of key workers. Do you think this recognition will continue?
I really hope so. I think there are many people out there, and and it's not just people that are being paid either. Let's not forget the people that stepped up to volunteer around at the beginning of COVID, and those that give their time every single day. I don't think necessarily, and the example given there is a good one. People don't necessarily know all the roles that are at play, and you can think about People see the visible roles, and I always remember going and meeting a dignitary after the Salisbury incident, and that I was surrounded by a guy in army uniform, a fireman, a policeman, and so it went on. And when the dignitary got to me, she said, "Well, you don't have a uniform, what do you do?" I make the tea. And it's that kind of thing. It's how we recognise the people's roles around us. But I really, really hope that not only from a public point of view, but I hope we have a greater appreciation of each other as well. Because I think we all understand, we've had different conversations, be it we're all talking from rooms in our homes, but we've got a different appreciation, different insight to each other's roles and how we all form part of that jigsaw that we didn't necessarily have before. So I hope the public do continue to appreciate the work that goes on the front line, but also behind the scenes. But I hope that we continue to support and have our more collaborative relationships.
And we have the inevitable final question. How did you feel about the dramatisation of the episode and the public response to it? Was it realistic?
I think the writers did an amazing job. They assimilated an awful lot of information into 3 hours. Of course, there are gaps. You know, there's no way they could have had 27 central characters, but they possibly could have chosen any one of those 27 agencies and focused on them. It's hugely humbling, but and whilst it's my character that's sort of portrayed and the story is told through my eyes, I truly hope it represents the incident in its fullest, because it wasn't about me. It was about a response to a most extraordinary event, and the way not only the professionals responded to that, but an amazing community and what they did with and for each other to get them through it. So it's certainly representative, and they captured some very key moments, and some of it was incredibly hard to watch. Because there is tragedy amongst it, and there's real stories behind it. But yeah, it was from a outside looking in, it was a great thing to be part of, and the kindness of the writers was incredible. So it was a lovely experience.
And did you think Anne Marie Duff captured your personality?
Yeah, she's more serious than me. She's a little bit more serious than I am. But we did spend a couple of days together, so she did sort of spend a little bit of time getting to know me and mannerisms and things, and my husband thankfully overshared, so she knows far more about me than I ever intended that she knows. So she could certainly bribe me on any occasion, I think. So yeah, she was great, and what she really is, she's very much for the people. So she was a real advocate, and just in terms of the way she spoke about the incident, you know, in the press she did afterwards. Yeah, phenomenal lady. Excellent.
Tracy, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your really fascinating insights into both your unexpected involvement in that global crisis, but also your very thoughtful, wider reflections on your work in emergency planning and public health. Our very best wishes to you for the next few months, for the vital work you're doing with Public Health England. And just remember your own lesson, make time for yourself.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And with that, back to Nicola.